Hi there, Tim from K-On. Today we're going to have a look at the transmission cooler for the 250, why you might want one, and then how to install one. In my previous vehicle, the 150, it was actually a known problem that the transmissions would overheat. And when they overheat, you introduce extra sort of compounds into the burnt fluid that can prematurely wear out your transmission. Now, we wanted to understand if that's still an issue with the newer vehicles, with the 250. So before we just sort of decided to create a transmission cooler for the 250, we did a little bit of testing. And what we found is a standard vehicle, no towing, no sort of forward driving, it's perfectly fine, transmission temperatures are good. We put a scan gauge in this vehicle to test that out. Now, if you're doing any towing in any hilly terrain or on soft sand, towing or not towing, you're definitely going to see elevated transmission temperatures. We saw them get up to 110 degrees in the sand and easily over 100 degrees towing in some hilly terrain. So the way the transmission is cooled in the 250 is very similar to the 150, where there is a core within the radiator and it uses the engine coolant to cool down the oil in the transmission. So your coolant temperature is about 80, 85 degrees. We're using that to cool down your transmission. What we found was that because of that, the transmission temperatures took a while to stabilise after you loaded it up. For example, when we went over the Cunningham's Gap or went up some hilly terrain and the temperatures got quite high, it took about 20 to 30 minutes for those temperatures to come back down. And you can understand why, because you're using hot fluid to cool down a hot fluid. Now, with a transmission cooler, an auxiliary transmission cooler, we found that those temperatures came down very quickly, within 5 to 10 minutes, if that. So that's another advantage of having an external cooler. Now, the cooler we're going to use is a TrueCool cooler, and it's going to be plumbed in series after the factory cooler, so the factory cooler is still operating. And the other advantage of that is that cooler will actually add to the cooling capacity of the entire system. So it'll help keep your transmission cooler, but also help keep your engine a little bit cooler too. The core we have chosen has a unique cold bypass feature. So what that means is when the fluid is colder, it's generally thicker, and there's some galleries in there that allows this thicker fluid to pass through the cooler more easily. So what that means is in a cold climate, your transmission oil will come up to temperature more quickly. Now, the effect of this sort of drops away at around the 60 degrees, and from that point on, it acts like a normal core. Now, the cooling effect you'll expect from this core is anywhere between 20 to 30 degrees reduction in transmission temperature. And during normal driving, because the core is there providing cooling, your transmission temperature will sit around the 60 to 65 degrees.
I thought it'd be good to simplify and explain how the components of the cooling system work and how they're plumbed up, how they're currently plumbed up, and how we will be adding a cooler in series. So we have our transmission, automatic transmission here. It's got an inlet and outlet, and the fluid gets pumped to the other areas of the vehicle, one being the radiator tank, which is where the factory cooler sits. And the factory cooler sits inside the radiator, which when you're at operating temperature is 90-degree coolant from your engine. So you're cooling down your transmission with 90-degree coolant. So the way it's plumbed up currently in a vehicle without a transmission cooler is the outlet, the hot fluid, goes into the bottom of the radiator tank. So that fluid might be 100 degrees all the way up to 130 degrees, goes into the radiator at 90 degrees, and it comes out the top. We'll use green because it's a little bit cooler. Comes out the top and goes back into the transmission. So that's the current cooling system that you'll have in your standard vehicle. We have our auxiliary cooler over here, so I'll rub all this out and I'll show you how we will plumb that one up. Okay, we want to install an auxiliary cooler and we want to install it in series. Now, the recommended practice is to have the auxiliary cooler, which is this new cooler over here, to be mounted in series with the current cooler, but after the factory cooler. So I'll show you how we do that. So the fluid needs to go into the factory cooler first. So as per normal, it's plumbed into the bottom of the radiator tank cooler. Now, when it comes out the top, it's cooled down a little. So we want to attach that to the new cooler. So what I'll do is we'll go this way, jump over, and we go into the bottom of the auxiliary cooler. Now once it's gone into the bottom of the auxiliary cooler, the advantage of the auxiliary cooler, the new cooler, is it's got ambient air running over the fins to help cool down that fluid. So you've got 20-degree air cooling down the oil, so you're going to get a much bigger reduction in oil temperature through this auxiliary cooler. Now once it's gone through the bottom, through the top, we send that back to the transmission. So we got the first stage of cooling through the radiator tank, comes back out the top into the auxiliary cooler, and then gets cooled by ambient air rushing over the fins, then gets sent back to the transmission. Let's have a chat about the bypass feature in the TrueCool cores. Now, the fluid in your transmission is designed to operate at a range of temperatures, and ideally you want it to be around 75 to 95 degrees. When the fluid is coming up to temperature and is cooler, your transmission might choose programming where the torque converter or your shift patterns will be changed, and you might notice differences in when the torque converter will lock and unlock, and you might not be able to access all the different shift programs or gears until the temperature of the fluid comes up to operating temperature. Now, what the bypass does is it helps your fluid get up to temperature quicker by allowing cool fluid to bypass the cooler and not actually get cooled, bypass the cooler and go back through your system until it gets up to temperature. Now, the effect of the bypass in this cooler starts to reduce at 82 degrees, which means more fluid goes through the cooler and starts getting cooled down. And then at 96 degrees, the entire core is operational and you'll get the full cooling effect. So this is how this operates, and it's a really ingenious system because it's all passive, no moving parts, and just operates and works. And it is a great feature to have, especially if you're in cooler climates, because you don't want that transmission to get extra cooling, especially when it doesn't need it. So there you go, that's how the bypass works in the TrueCool cooler cores.
This is the transmission cooler kit for the 250. Now, installing a transmission cooler can be challenging and a little bit daunting, so we've purposely tried to make it as easy as possible, and I've learnt a few things over the years. Now, this is the TrueCool core. You can see the internal bypass there. It has some bigger galleries to allow the thicker, colder fluid to bypass. The other thing I really like about the TrueCool cores is the construction. The fins are much more sturdy, and overall, just the construction is much more robust, even down to the fact that these hose tails are machined and thicker and stronger, and they've got a nice little gusset down the bottom. They're held in place by some bracketry that attaches to the vehicle. There's no drilling or anything like that, so captive holes. And we've also changed the way we route our hose, and we're going to use a splice a hose tail, which is a little bit different, but it makes the install much, much easier. So we've designed the transmission cooler kit to actually maximize the space within that cavity in the front of this vehicle. Now, because of that, we actually can't attach the brackets on first and install the core because there's not enough space. So there's a bit of an order of operations, and I just want to show the core and the brackets outside of the vehicle, how it's all assembled, because it's a bit hard to show it once it's on the vehicle. Now, we're going to use Australian terminology, and this bracket will sit on the passenger side of the vehicle, and this bracket is on the driver's side. The bracket will sit underneath the core, and the core is flipped over, and it gets attached to the bracket on the passenger side. And then once that's installed, we attach it to the bracket on the other side. Now, the other thing we have to do as well is attach the hoses, because there's not enough space to tighten those hose clamps. So the way this gets installed is we get access to that space within the vehicle. We'll install the passenger side bracket. We'll have the core with the correct length hoses already assembled. We'll feed that in, and then we'll attach the other bracket. So what we'll do now is we'll get this core ready and attach the hoses. It's going to be much easier to attach these hoses outside of the vehicle. So we're going to cut these to length, attach them to the core before we install them in the vehicle. Now, check the orientation of the core. It needs to be with the mounting flange above the hose, so you can sort of see how it's arranged there. We've got the longer hose on the bottom. So this is going to be the bottom port. This hose is the hose that's supplied with the True Cool kit. You'll see it included with the bag of hardware. We want to cut this to 1 meter, 1 meter long. That gives us a little bit of wiggle room once we get it installed. Now the top hose is an extra bit of hose that's supplied. It's 700 mil long, so it's the shorter hose goes to the top. And that gives us a little bit of wiggle room to adjust once it's installed in the vehicle too. Grab a couple of hose clamps. These are included in the True Cool core kit, and attach these to the core and tighten them up. So I'm going to slide that on. And I'll just turn that around so that it doesn't get in the way, and I'll tighten these up. You'll see what I mean by you won't have any room in the vehicle to do this once it's all installed. So that's ready, and now we'll go get the vehicle prepped. So the core is going to sit in behind the bumper here in this position, so we'll need to get access by removing this cover. The cooler will then be plumbed into the transmission cooler on this side of the radiator, so our hoses will be routed through this way. So let's get this cover off first, and there's a few other little bits and pieces we need to get out of the way to make it easier to install. Okay, to get these covers off, you just push down on these clips and just pull them out. Make sure they don't fly up. Okay, we'll put that to one side. You're going to sit in pretty much underneath this cross member with our hoses coming over the top and then back into the factory cooler. So to get a bit more access, we're going to remove this little plastic shroud and also the horn. Grab a 12mm socket, get that out of the way. Now what I like to do is I like to unclip the horn as well, just so it doesn't hang and sort of dangle. I'm just going to put the 12mm one back because we're going to use that a little bit later. Just pop these clips off. Now just pull that out of the way. We won't have to actually unclip anything else. There's actually a little clip there that you need to sort of push and unclip as well, but that one came out fairly easily. So now we've got some access in this space here to install the passenger side bracket. This is the passenger side bracket. This top hole is where the horn was attached, and this little notch on the bottom goes onto a little bit of a end of a bolt with a nut down the bottom there. The other thing we've also done, we've nut-serted because we know how hard it's going to be to try to hold a nut in the back there when there's not much space. So we've supplied an M10 fine nut. We'll install that in place on the end of this stud on the bottom here, and then we can slide this bracket in place. So the lower mount of the passenger side bracket actually mounts to the back side of this bolt here. There's a bit of a stud, a bit of thread showing. Hopefully you can see that. So what we're going to do is we're going to just initially wind on this nut on the back of that bolt. So you can see that there. And leave a little bit of a gap. Grab the passenger side bracket and you see that this open slot in the bottom will be secured by that nut that we've just installed. So I'm just going to slide that in over that threaded stud, and then the top hole gets secured by the bolt that holds the horn in. Now we're not going to install the horn just yet. We're just going to nip it up and hold it in place so that all the brackets are sort of in the position that we need. So that's the passenger side. We don't need to tighten that one up yet. We'll tighten everything once it's all in. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to slide this core in position. Now your core with the hoses attached already and hose tails tightened up, we're going to slide it in between this gap. Now just be careful you don't bang this up against any of the radiator or the fins that are in this position. And what we want to do, I'm going to slide it in there and get it sitting in front of that bracket that we just installed. And there you go. And you might just have to grab the hoses to help it move a bit. And there you go. So that's sitting in front there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab little M6 bolts and get them attached. And this is why we put nutserts on them. And then we'll get the other top one going as well. You can see that position at the top there. Cool. I'm just going to nip them up. While I'm at it, I'll actually tighten the one on the bottom there just so it doesn't flop around too much. Yeah, that's good. So that's the passenger side one installed but not tightened. We're going to install the driver's side bracket and then we're going to tighten it all up. We got the other bracket. Now what we've done, we've actually removed that plastic shroud that was here just to make it a bit easier to see. And the way this one goes in is it actually attaches to this slot here and this vertical bracket that comes down from the middle. Now I'm going to tuck it in behind the core and then grab my M6 bolt and just attach it to the nutsert that's on the end of that bracket, and I'll nip it up and that should hold it in place so I can get the other bolts in. I'll grab another M6 bolt and we should be able to line up the top bolt, that's the top one, and then I'll get the bottom one. And this is why we keep everything nice and loose, makes it so much easier to line everything up. And there you go, that's the bottom one. So what I'll do now is I'll nip everything up and just get them all snug, make sure the position is all good and all the brackets are happy. And that one's good. And we'll go ahead and tighten it all up. So I'm going to tighten all these M6 hex bolts first. So one onto the cooler, one at the top. So that's all the M6s tightened, and then I'm going to go and tighten the M10 nut on the bottom. We'll need to grab a 15mm open spanner for this one. Okay, and the last thing we need to do is reattach the horn. So there's my horn, and I'll plug it back in and just sandwich it over the top. So that's our core in position, and you can see how it's tucked in behind there and it looks very factory. You almost can't notice it in there. Let's clip this plastic shroud back, and then the next thing we need to do is run all our hose and connect up our hose. The cooler is now secured. Next thing to do is to route our hoses. Now we've got this really handy plastic sort of cross-membery thing that's got a bunch of holes that we can cable tie to. The other thing we need to consider is we've got a bit of a sharp edge here, so we have to make sure that the hoses are held in place and not rubbing against those sharp edges. These will then come around and connect to the outlet of the factory cooler. The other thing to note when you're doing this is to make sure the hoses sit down low enough so when you put the cover back on, it doesn't sort of sit above it, but it's a very tidy way to run the hoses. So we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, take your time routing these hoses and do a nice neat job to make sure it's not going to rub on anything. So grab the cable ties, and what I tend to do is I'll hold one of these hoses up against this, and then I'll attach the other hose and hold them both together and keep them nice and neat. And the other thing I'll do too is the lower hose, which is this one. It comes up in front of the thermofan, so you can actually cable tie it to the side of the thermofan just to hold that in place down the bottom as well. So I'll go ahead and do that. So that's that top one, plenty of clearance. Run this bottom one. See there? We've got a nice bit of space there, and it's nice and neat. So I won't cinch everything down just yet. I'll just run the rest of it. That's probably the hardest part, just to make sure we get good clearance there. Then the rest of it is pretty easy. Before we go any further, I'm going to leave these ends loose because what we're going to do now is we're going to actually fill these with some transmission fluid. We've added some extra volume to the tyre system, being these hoses and the transmission core. So we'll just top that up with fluid so we don't affect the level of the transmission fluid. We're going to top this up with some Toyota WS ATF fluid. A bit hard to get in quantities smaller than this can. You're only going to need about 200 or 300 mil. You could also use an equivalent automatic transmission fluid from, say, your Penrite or any other trusted brand. Now I'm going to fill this from the bottom of the core, and this is the hose that comes from the bottom, the little longer one. I'm going to just use a bit of a funnel there, and when I fill that, it should come out the top. And when the fluid starts coming out of the top of this hose, we know we've filled it up. So let's go ahead and do that. And then we'll connect it all up and try not to make too much of a mess. Now take your time filling it up because we need to make sure the air doesn't get locked up in the core. So nice red fluid. Yep, it's going in. I actually 3D printed this little funnel because I couldn't find my other ones, but handy little things, the printers. Okay, I'll just let it drain a bit before I go anymore, but yep, it's definitely filling. And I'll give it a bit more gravity, a bit more pressure. So if you don't want to use your kitchen funnel to do this, I generally do, but we'll put this file on GrabCAD and you can print your own. Oh, here it is, here it goes. There it is, caught it in time. Look at that, see? It's just right there. Woo. Okay, I didn't make a mess, but I put a rag down just in case. We are fluid full. Just gonna plug these hoses up so I don't spill it everywhere. So just these couple of M10 bolts. You could use some sort of vice grips or clamps just to clamp the ends of those. So on the driver's side of the radiator, you'll see the transmission cooler, the factory transmission cooler. So the oil actually comes in from the bottom there into the side of the radiator, gets cooled down by the coolant from the engine at about 80 degrees, and then comes back out the top and goes back to the transmission. The way we're going to plumb this up is we're going to attach the bottom of the auxiliary transmission cooler to the outlet of the factory cooler. So that's this pipe here. It'll come down and join to the outlet. So it'll go through the core and then get cooled by ambient temperature, 20-degree air temperature. The cooled fluid will then come back, and then we're going to attach this hose to the hose that we removed that will take it back to the transmission. Now, previously we would actually remove this hose and connect it all the way down the bottom, but by doing this, it's a lot easier to do and much more easy to put it back and put it back to factory. Now, to do this, we need a hose tail sort of splice, and this is included in the True Cool kit. And what we need to do is we just need to tighten those two together to make sure we get a nice tight seal, and then install this, plumb it all in. So we'll go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to join these hose tails together and make sure I get a nice seal. There's a taper inside there, so they should seal if we torque them up. So I'll get a couple of 19mm spanners, tighten those together. So that's ready. So next thing I'll do is I'll take the factory hose off and install this on the top. Grab me a set of pliers and just squeeze on that hose clamp. There you go. Just be careful when you take this hose off, it can dribble a bit. No, ooh, yep. A bit of a dribble. Yeah, it's only a little bit. This hose tail on the top and then move this hose clamp back up. There you go. So what we have now is we have the outlet of the transmission cooler, the factory transmission cooler, and then we got the hose going back to the transmission. So we're just going to connect those up now. The hose going to the bottom of the cooler will go into this one, it's the longer one. So we'll grab that one, we'll grab some hose tail clamps as well. Actually, I don't need to put that one back in. Okay. Put my thumb over it, and then I'll go down and hook it up into there. There you go. So what I'll do now, that's up against there. Secure it with the hose clamp. Cool. And then all that's left is this other one here. So we'll grab we're quick, we shouldn't spill any fluid. That's the return going back to the transmission. And plug that in. And that's the hose that goes from the top of the cooler. We'll tighten that up. Okay, so it's all plumbed in now. Now all we have to do is secure all the hoses and get them all in a position that we're happy, that it's not going to sort of rub and so forth. So we'll go do that and then we'll put it all back. So the bottom hose here, I've actually run it just in front of the thermofan, and it's quite easy to get a cable tie on there and hold that in place, and that just helps with all the routing. I have all the hoses secured, I'm really happy with it. Now things to check and look out for, make sure you're not rubbing it against this edge, that's sharp, this edge here on the top here, and then also down the bottom here, make sure it's not rubbing on that edge. Also just make sure that your hoses are not too tightly sort of bent, because you don't want any kinks or anything like that. And the last thing you want to do is also make sure that this cover goes back on, because the hoses should sit underneath there. And before we put this back, I'm going to actually run the car, make sure we don't have any leaks. Top there's fine. And up here, the join. Transmission cooler install's finished. Relatively easy install and very neat and tidy. Now, if you're going to load up your vehicle, be it you're going to do regular towing, four-wheel driving or beach work, definitely going to make a difference having the transmission cooler. If you want that extra peace of mind and that extra bit of protection and cooling for your vehicle, it doesn't hurt to have the transmission cooler installed. Now, for more information, visit our website, kayan.com.au.